saying, offline, online. It has to be the same. This has to be understood by governments as well. What we are witnessing now in many countries is the enactment of laws that seriously undermine the importance of human rights. These measures, as well as bureaucratic, military, intelligence and police apparatus that they create, are not necessarily temporary, proportional, necessary, or in conformity with the relevant legal standards. On the contrary. In such context, human rights defenders, journalists and the media generally often find themselves in opposition to their governments. They decry the individual cases of rights violations and insist the effective and transparent oversight mechanism be created to ensure that laws and systems integrate and respect human rights. By pitting human rights, and I will end with this, concerns and security issues against each other, we run the risk that both will be conquered. We may find ourselves with no security and no rights. Thank you.
Thank you. And just a quick clarification, I think cybersecurity and human rights are not incompatible, rather than not compatible. But unfortunately, too often they are, in practice, incompatible. So we need to work on that. And last but not least, Anya.
Thank you, Dixie, and very good to be here. I'm in between you and questions and I'm sure there are many people who would like to make a comment on this issue themselves. What I wanted to comment on is building a little bit on the approach that Johan put forward to have a more positive approach of human rights and cybersecurity. Dixie and I actually worked together on a paper which kind of developed some of those ideas, where we really tried to look at what is happening at the moment, and we felt that the current approaches to human rights and cybersecurity are very much about making sure that threats are absent. A positive approach, as Johan said, would put people back at the center. And when you put people back at the center, we were thinking of debates in food security to kind of think about what would that then mean on the internet. What is it that you really require? And we thought the most important things for people to feel secure on the internet is to actually be able to be fearless. So we see fearlessness as at the heart of this concept of a positive approach to human rights, which also means that it's not just the right to privacy that is crucial to make sure that people are secure on the internet. The right to privacy has gotten a lot of attention already in this context, but also the right to freedom of expression. And that is as crucial to cybersecurity as privacy is, I think, is something that's often forgotten. Rather than expanding on this, though, because I'm very conscious of time, I thought maybe I should get into a little more on the reasons why we have gotten where we have gotten, because very clearly that's not the approach of cybersecurity we have right now. And for most human rights activists working on internet issues, if you mention the word cybersecurity, they all shudder and go like, ooh. So what got us here, and what are then consequently also some of the areas that we as human rights activists need to work on to change the situation? I think first of all we need far greater definitional clarity. At the moment all kinds of concepts are clubbed together under the cybersecurity debate. So child pornography comes under cybersecurity, attacks on critical infrastructure that might put the whole electricity grid in your country down is privacy and security. Fraud is cybersecurity. So it's become a catch-all category for everything that might possibly be wrong with the internet. That's a real problem, because for some of these problems, we actually already have solutions. For example, if you look at content-related crimes on the internet, like child pornography, I think over the past few years, a lot of work has been done on these issues, and there are fairly clear guidelines that exist in terms of how to assess whether something is justifiably taken down or not, etc. Those things already exist. The nature of those threats is also very, very different from, say, a threat to critical infrastructure. So those kind of distinctions are being elided as we kind of have these catch-all categories. So the first thing to do is tease out what are these different problems. Since it hasn't happened, there is also a massive sense of alarm that has been created, where governments use this boogie of cybercrime or cyber security to justify all kinds of things without them really making very clear anymore how real the danger in question is, how much of a threat this actually is, and also whether the responses in question are both necessary and proportionate. At the moment we see measures happening that perhaps in some way deal with the problem that has been posted, but not necessarily need to be taken to be able to deal with that problem. Often a much more targeted response could actually be much more effective. And finally, I think a problem that needs to be addressed as well is that by having this kind of definitional mess and a consequent sense of alarm about almost every single issue that comes in that catch-all cybersecurity category, it's also, we've also seen that the somewhat duplicitous role of many governments has been hidden from view. Governments have actually been quite proactive at exploiting some of the vulnerabilities that exist to their own ends. So while cybersecurity discourses supposedly exist to say that we need to deal with such vulnerabilities and stop them, a virus like Stuxnet, for example, was actually exploiting those very same vulnerabilities that governments claim that they are fighting. And the same is true of many security measures. If we as individuals want to be safe, what we need is higher levels of encryption, higher levels of, more tools to be able to protect ourselves. And much of what goes in the name of strategies to combat threats to cybersecurity at the moment actually undermines that, at least for individuals. In fact, that's perhaps one of the most important, I think, issues that so clearly comes into the framework if you use a positive approach to security. That surveillance and cybersecurity, even though they're often mentioned in the same name, very often contradict each other, and that a lot of the surveillance measures undermine cybersecurity. It also has been kind of elided that a lot of surveillance measures are not taken to deal with cybercrime as such, but with crimes that exist offline. Let's say, for example, it's often claimed that we need greater surveillance to deal with terrorists. Terrorists have been having conversations before the internet existed as well. So in that sense, it's not a new problem. This is not a problem to which the internet is integral as such. It has perhaps taken it to a different level. So I think that's another thing where we really need to start seeing these two things as separate discourses rather than clubbing them together. Finally, I wanted to make a comment perhaps on where to take forward this debate with governments also, because that has very clearly become the need, especially if you want to point out that governments have a duplicitous role. We need to sit together with them around the table. Some people have been saying that this is actually the time to start forming a global body that will deal with this kind of issues. I think most people in the room have had these discourses around whether or not the UN should take over the internet before. That's obviously a shorthand for a very complicated debate. But, and some people have said, well, now you see, we need global rules on these kind of issues, and so that's a good reason to start working on such a body. I think we have to be really, really careful to go down that road. I do think it points out a need for global coordination, global rules, and I, for one, actually think that governments often need to collaborate more. But that doesn't mean a centralized body is the solution. For one reason, because that gives the idea that, for example, in the whole PRISM scandal, it's not as if the interests of the users and the interests of the governments are fully aligned in solving this problem. So to kind of say that there is a government body that needs to solve this for us now by having governments talk to each other, I think is a somewhat naive view. Finally, also, I think, to solve this kind of issue, what we need is not more traditional control of governments on the internet, because that is part of the current problem, that governments are trying to assert that control. That's why we've gotten where we have. Instead, what we need is a much more distributed approach to governance, in which you build that kind of take into account the nature of the internet as well, which after all is a global space, a lot of it in hands of private actors. So you need networks of governance institutions, actors, domestically and internationally as well, that kind of keep each other in check, because they need each other based on relations of mutual restraint to ensure that we're all staying safe. So I've also been asked to wrap up, so I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anya. Time's getting on, so we really want to open it up as fast as possible for lots and lots of comments from the floor, I hope. I can't see very well with the lights and the smoke, so if you want to make a comment, please raise your hand and wave. Oh, we've got two over here in the front. Is there a microphone and another, Bertrand? There's meant to be a microphone. Yeah, it's coming now, I think. If you can come down the front. Okay, so if everyone can get to the key points as fast as possible so that as many people can have a chance to speak, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Hi. Nice to see you guys. So I've been working on this stuff for about a decade, and I've been trying to tell people that this was coming. And, most people have sort of ignored it until it's in their face. And so I think we need to recognize that there is a disconnection between policy and reality. So for example, in Sweden with the FRA law, there's this idea that a judge will sign off on every surveillance order. The problem is that that is basically impossible. Unless we say that surveillance is, let's say, only when a human listens to the data that is recorded. So I think we need to talk about this in a more realistic sense, which is, what is the architecture of this oppression in a large sense? And how is it that you will be sure that the Chinese don't take over the FRA's spying machine, for example? And how is it that other countries will do this as well, right? For example, when policy and mathematics don't line up, how is it that we will verify or know that the assertions we make are true? Because what I see is this so-called lawful interception, in theory, has all these checks and balances, and in practice, you guys aren't even sovereign nations because my country spies on you. So this is an interesting thing to call that, democratic. Like, how can you protect the privacy rights of your citizens if you're not a sovereign nation? You can't. And what PRISM and Upstream and Boundless Informant have showed us is that regardless of your parliamentary discussions and policies, there actually is not the effect that you want. And so when Carl Bildt gets up and says to a whole room of people that surveillance is fine, especially when it's done undercover and so on, I mean, other than being embarrassing, I wonder, is it obvious to you that policy and reality are not connected at all? And that's, I guess, a question to everyone, because Sweden at least has the facade of democracy, whereas the US, we don't have that at all, right? I mean, none of you voted on what has been happening in the US, and it affects every single one of you. In fact, everyone that's not an American in this room is worth even less, apparently. I don't think that, but, and I'm sorry on behalf of America for what our country has done to the whole planet. Really, I mean, in terms of surveillance, really, I'm sorry about that. It's really embarrassing.
Thank you. I think that the lady next to you was wanting to make a point. Oh, and yeah, he's passed the microphone around.
السلام عليكم. أنا آسف مضطر أتكلم بالعربي. الحقيقة كل ما عرض من آراء وأفكار للسادة المحاضرين هي معلومات مهمة ومفيدة وتثير كثير من الشؤون الفنية والقانونية المتداخلة. الحقيقة التوازن أو بين مفردة الحرية والمراقبة أو متطلبات الأمن ممكن يعني توصف بأنها مثل الزواج الغير قانوني أو غير شرعي بهذا الجانب. لا يمكن تحت متطلبات الأمن أو الضرورات الاجتماعية والسياسية والدينية نحد من قضية الحرية والتعبير عن الرأي واستخدام وسائل الاتصال المتطورة في هذا الجانب. لو رجعنا قديما في الستينيات أو سبعينيات القرن الماضي، على الرغم من عدم انتشار وسائل الاتصال الحديثة، إلا أنه كانت دائما الحكومات المستبدة أو الشمولية كانت تستخدم هذه المفردات للحد من التعبير عن الرأي. أنا حقيقة عجبني المداخلة الأخيرة اللي تفضلت بها السيدة، هو القضية تتطلب يعني معالجات، قد يكون على مستوى الوطني أو المستوى الإقليمي أو المستوى الدولي. لا يمكن أن تحت أي مفهوم أن تحد من هذا الأمر أو توازن بين الحرية والمراقبة أو لدواعي الأمنية والسياسية وغيرها ما لم تكن هناك قوانين ضامنة لهذا التوازن. القوانين لابد أن تكون دساتير أولا، وبعد ذلك قوانين داخلية تضمن هذه القضية وتكون يعني كفيلة بهذا التوازن على المستوى الداخلي. هذا الأمر الثاني. على المستوى الداخلي لابد أن يكون جهاز قضائي متطور مستقل حيادي لضمان تطبيق القوانين بشكل عادل وشفاف فيما يتعلق بخلق التوازن في هذا المجال. لابد أن تخلق مؤسسات، هذه المؤسسات أيضا مستقلة للضمان. هذا على المستوى المحلي. على المستوى الدولي أنا أعتقد هذه القضية لابد أن يجلب الانتباه فيها على المستوى الدولي. كل التحديات الكبيرة اللي واجهت المجتمع الدولي فيما يتعلق بالحرية وبالتعبير عن الرأي أخذتها على عاتقها مؤسسات دولية. لابد أن ينهض القانون الدولي في هذا المجال لوضع آليات وضوابط لكيفية النفاذ أو الوصول أو لضمان الحرية. أنا لا أريد أن أنهي في العراق. أنا من العراق، وكيل وزارة اتصالات في العراق. رغم ما نتعرض إليه من قتل يوميا بسبب العمليات الإرهابية وتراق دماء بريئة يوميا، إلا أننا يعني وأنا مختص وأعلم في هذا لم نستخدم الانترنت كوسيلة للحد من هذا. لن نحجب مواقع، لن نحارب حرية الوصول لهذه المواقع سواء كان على المستوى الفرد أو على المستوى المؤسسات. شكرا.
Thank you very much. I wanted to have lots of rounds back and forth, but I think that's going to be difficult. So what I want to do is take as many questions and comments as we can. Please make them as brief as you can so lots of people can speak, and then we'll have like a final wrap up from so if you want to speak, there's someone at the back there. We have Bertrand, the fellow at the front. Bertrand, do you want to start?
Hi, my name is Bertrand Lachapelle from the Internet and Jurisdiction Project. Just to quickly support points that Anya made, if you look at the title itself, each of the terms, not only the terms in between themselves, but each of the terms has an internal tension. The Human Rights Framework, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, has the internal tension between 19 and 29 articles. Likewise, when we talk about cybersecurity, whatever the definition is, there is a tension between the security for the citizens and the security for the communities or the state. So managing this tension is the basic challenge. And what I wanted to support is Anya's remark that not only do we need clarity in the definitions and subdividing the issues, what I usually call corralling the issues in their respective buckets so that they are not lumped all together and serve as an alibi for overall surveillance. But more importantly, once you've corralled the issues in their own buckets, you need to get an approach, or we need to get an approach that is building issue-based governance networks and frameworks, each with the respective stakeholders that are attached to the different issues. And the more we lump the issues together, the harder it is to actually address them.
Do you have a microphone? Do you have a microphone at the back? No. Okay, great. Please.
هل يمكن أن أطرح سؤالي باللغة العربية؟ شكرا. سؤالين بطريق مباشرين. السؤال الأول يعني تعقيبا على حديث السيد وكيل الوزارة من العراق، يعني نتمنى يعطينا توضيحات عن محاولات القانونية الأخيرة لتقييد الحريات الإلكترونية في العراق، كمثال على محاربة الحريات الإلكترونية باسم الحرب على الإرهاب. والسؤال الثاني طبعا المشاركين المتحدثين، وهو ألا يعني بناء على القضايا مثل بريزم وبرامج التي انكشفت مؤخرا، هل يمكن القول أنه في الحقيقة اليوم الحكومات في الدول الغربية وطبعا في الدكتاتوريات هي التي تشكل أكبر تهديد على حريات مستخدمي الإنترنت وعلى خصوصيتهم على مستوى العالم كله؟ شكرا.
Thank you. Can we have the microphone down the front over here and then over there afterwards? Yeah. First,
well, security and human rights, very complex topic. I try to be brief and here, hello. Just go direct to the question. Maybe in the concept of security, governments, we can't change what governments want. Sometimes they fake some events and actions just to justify some new security measures. From my perspective, the more security measures applied, the less human rights and the less freedom of expressions spread into the society. Okay, that's maybe a different topic and maybe very complex topic on the government level. But my question is, what can we do on the private business level? I would just mention quickly in a small example. I mean, there's sanctions, US sanctions against the Syrian regime since many, many years already. Still, hack activist group, telecomics group found 34 blue code servers running in Syria. And for those who don't know what blue code servers are, they were listed and named as the enemy of the internet, censorship, monitoring activities in internet, and so on. And we know all what's going around in the human rights domain in Syria and other countries. They say they sold it via third party, okay, but what about they sold it directly to Burma, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, China, Russia? So those are very well known of respecting human rights for sure. So what about selling them directly to them? So my question is, as human rights activists maybe and interested in the security domain, what can we do in the private business domain? We can't influence a lot about the governments, maybe, but what can we do for the private companies?
thank you, and thank you for bringing the private sector in. Which can we have the microphone over that side? We have another comment over in the side, and if there's anyone from the private sector in the room, if there's anyone from the private sector in the room, it would really be good to hear your perspectives on this as well. I think there's a hand at the back, so we'll go to that. I'll go to you after.
Thank you. I'm Arwa Harbi. I'm an active member in the Leaders' Council of Tunis, sponsored by Search for Common Ground, and I'll be speaking for myself and on behalf of my friend Hamza, who's a member in the same council. So while discussing our we in the council we are working on a project about cyber violence and cyber security, and while talking about our activities, we noticed that most of us, even here, even when listening to the speeches, go to the use of deterrent means rather than preventive means. Sorry. So it's true that I'm not comfortable with the fact that the government or there are people who are spying on my emails and can read what I do on the internet. But what I'm curious about is to know the reason behind these aggressions, because if the reasons are not related to the internet, to the cyberspace, then I'm not safe after all. So my question is: are there any ideas of raising awareness about this cyber violence? There isn't awareness about the threats of cyber violence, because what we want to do in Search for Common Ground or the Leaders' Council is to establish a code of responsible use of internet. And honestly, we can't find many ideas that inspire us in the world, and thank you very much.
A useful reminder that some of the threats are very, very real. There's a man at the back of the room, I think, if someone can give him the microphone, and then we'll have Erin at the front, and then I think we'll come back to the panel, so start thinking about what issues you're going to come back on. Thanks.
Oui, bonjour, je suis Michel Faye de la Fondation pour la démocratie et les droits de l'homme en Afrique. Je voudrais attirer l'attention des panélistes et aussi demander quelque chose, c'est-à-dire la délimitation juridique de l'utilisation d'Internet par rapport au nouveau contexte géopolitique international. Plusieurs intervenants ont évoqué quand même des questions multiples liées à ce phénomène, mais moi je voudrais demander, quels sont les mécanismes juridiques que vous pensez mettre en œuvre et qui pourront nous permettre d'avoir quand même une certaine couverture vis-à-vis des gouvernements qui souvent aussi ne sont pas partants pour comme la libéralisation de ce secteur. Et aussi avouer que compte tenu du nouveau contexte politique dans lequel nous vivons dans beaucoup de pays, il est nécessaire de constater que Internet n'est pas seulement aussi positif à l'émergence d'une nouvelle masse critique. Il y a aussi quand même des phénomènes sur lesquels on devrait réfléchir et aussi que vous devrez donc nous parler. Le côté négatif, là aussi c'est très important. Mais aujourd'hui, nous avons constaté que beaucoup de masses passent par Internet quand même pour développer leurs activités, tantôt criminelles, tantôt aussi quand même positifs vis-à-vis de cette nouvelle génération. Moi, je voudrais juste demander quels sont les programmes qui sont prévus en vue donc de créer un arsenal juridique qui pourrait quand même permettre de limiter certains quand même dégâts collatéraux que ce phénomène pourrait poser. Donc c'est juste cette question que je voudrais quand même poser et puis avoir votre point de vue là-dessus. Je vous remercie beaucoup.
Thank you, Aaron.
Hi. Wanted to clarify something about private sector's involvement in cybersecurity, such as whatever you want to call it. I don't like that word at all. But the companies are complicit. There's no doubt about this. We know that Blue Coat knows what Syria is doing, for instance. We know that AIMSIS in Morocco, which is tied to a company that made card punches and card counters for the Nazis back in the, knows what they're doing. We know, I've worked at companies that knew exactly what was going on behind those doors, and they sell it in order to be complicit because it makes money. There's a role for civil society in calling the companies to account just as much as the governments. It's a public-private partnership in the biggest way possible. And so our target, I guess, for lack of a better word, is not just the government. The government is only half the problem. The companies that make this stuff, they're the ones that are also in the middle of it.
Thank you. I'm afraid we're going to finish with the audience discussion and come back to the panel. There are a lot of issues to reflect on there about the right legal frameworks, about the problem where you can have the best legal frameworks in the world, but if it's not matched by what happens in practice, then what do you do? The problems about some of the concerns of violence online and how do we respond to these. I'm going to go to the panel in the same order that we started with. So Robert, please.
Great. As I just tweeted, too many issues, too little time, not sure what to do, but I'll express some quick comments. I think a couple of thoughts and something building on what Dunya mentioned is I think I would go further. I would just say that we're in a unique moment in time right now. If we don't get it right in the short period, we will lose the very framework and the very internet we have long known, and I would say that the internet we have known will instead be a dream that has long faded. And I think that's the case. The changes are underway at the standards, the governance, the infrastructure way, and a very important thing that has not been mentioned is for a long time it's been Western countries, the US and Europe, that have driven the standards and that driven the use. In a way, we've created the infrastructure and created the norms. So it's really where the users are that's driving the norms. Where are the users now? We've saturated in the Western countries. It's shifting to developing countries, to the south and to the east, where other issues, religion and elsewhere, play a more important role. So if we can't get it right now, as the demographic shifts, after the technology gets made in other countries, it won't be US technology we'll be talking about. It'll be Chinese technology, it'll be Cuban technology, it'll be other technology that we don't have any levers to influence, and we'll just lose it. Rebecca mentioned it today, and I think that's something that people do not realize, that we really have a short period of time. Another kind of comments is people were talking about, well, we need to strike a balance, we need to do things at a national level. Let's not forget there are international instruments that Johan and others here could talk about. This has already been discussed. We don't have to create new things. There is a balance, but let's build on an international framework. Let's not say, well, our country's different. There's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and how that's been interpreted, and things that have gone to the Human Rights Council that we need to look at and go from there, because otherwise we'll lose it. And I think the thing that was mentioned, I think, Jacob, I think you've been writing about this for a long time, and issues related to a lot of your things really shows that if a person from a developed democracy is treated in a certain way, what do we expect, I think, from others? So I think it's really important that people realize that there are issues in developed countries as well, that we're open about it, but I think that there need to be also examples in developing countries of things that go well, and they can be an example. So I think Tunisia is uniquely there. There are a lot of challenges and a lot of other issues, but there need to be other countries too from other regions. Latin America is particularly important. What are the good examples from different parts of Asia and in Africa as well? They did not come up in their conversation and are critically important. And then to a last point, and again, it's been a lot of different things that have been mentioned, is you mentioned the issue of blue code and surveillance. There's been a lot of work that's happened at a European level, particularly about Privacy International, but also the European Parliament and others that have looked about this what some refer to kind of an arms trade in digital weapons that can be used to conduct surveillance and censorship and really control the internet. I think we can talk about all these things, but something that's particularly important is we really need hard facts and we really need hard data. And so the Citizen Lab, together with Privacy International and many others, and some of our research colleagues are here, we have reports online that have actually mapped. We did a survey of the internet where these tools are, and increasingly we're finding them in more and more countries. They're not just in developed democracies. They're in many other countries as well, Syria and elsewhere. But once you have the data that's available, that's independent, then others can use it. So I think something that hasn't come up is the role of both independent judiciary, but also academia and others that generate the data that we can see what the real situation is. Because if we don't realize what the risks, what the threats are, we will make assumptions, build digital security, digital training on the wrong assumptions, and we will have a false sense of security, just like we have a false sense of internet freedom. Situation, like Rebecca and others have mentioned, is really dire. And it's really up to us to come forward, and the coalition have come forward, but there needs to be a far more passionate debate, both in democracies and elsewhere. So I'll look forward to everyone else's comments. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to ask the panelists to stick to 2 minutes each. Sorry. Okay, 2.5 minutes.
Robert, you spoke for about 5 minutes.
I know. I'm sorry.
All right. Thank you. I was giving questions about our legislation, so I'll start there. So the FRA law, as I said, I wish I could just say that I can promise everyone that it will never be hijacked by anyone, ever, not by any country, but I can't. I'm not in that position. I have no idea. But what I can say, this is the way we, in our democracy, try to solve the issue of protecting privacy when conducting signal surveillance. So every search that is being done under this law, which is enacted in open procedure by Parliament, is approved by a court. And this court is not a military court. It's a civil court led by civil judges. The court takes decision on each and every search according to search strings, time, and also which parts of the network the search is going to take place in. The workings of the court is supervised by an inspectorate. The inspectorate has the duty and the task to monitor the court's dealings, the court's approvals and non-approvals of searches. Individuals can also turn to this inspectorate and request information. Have I been target of surveillance? In 2011, that happened in 3 cases. 3 individuals asked the inspectorate. In addition to this, the FRA law is being subject to monitoring and evaluation by a parliamentary committee that reports back to Parliament. There have been suggestions for improvements of the legislation and of its implementation. And it deals with competence for making better adjustments, better assessments of necessity for searches. It has dealt with destruction of data. It has dealt with reporting procedures. So there is a constant sort of evaluation of the FRA law and its implementation. And those evaluations can be read. They're online. You can go and have a look, see what the problems were. So this is our take on this. So it's not about striking a balance between security and human rights. Human rights needs to be protected at all times, even when we take security measures. Yeah? So I think that is my 2 minutes, actually. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dunya.
Well, I'll try just to wrap up in a way, not to answering any question in particular, because I don't think we have time. We can only say that cyber threats are real. We have to be able to say, that we need security, and maybe to look at it in a bit, more positive way, as Anya was saying. Militarizing cyberspace will not bring any good, just damage. What we also need to realize, and in my humble view, say that there is no need for more resolutions and more papers and more commitments or more issues in order to continue producing words. I think we have more than enough in international arena. If we look at the United Nations, if we look all other international organizations, we have a landmark resolution on internet freedom by the Human Rights Council that Sweden initiated. But in reality, what is happening that the governments are not valuing and honoring these commitments and resolutions. So what needs to be done is that maybe Freedom Online Coalition has this noble goal and very important task to do something in order to push these governments to value and to honor these commitments. Because in my work, what I face, most of the times when I have cases that are human rights violations, I'm talking about journalists, bloggers, social media activists being put in prison, the answer is they are not there because of freedom of expression, but because they are drug dealers, they are terrorists, and all these other charges that most of people in the countries that are not valuing and honoring freedoms in general are answering to. So this needs to be done, and I think we need to be more honest when we discuss these issues. Otherwise, we will end up somewhere where we do not want, in some kind of dark societies and closed societies that many of us even experienced. So I think I will use for an end a quote of a very dear friend of mine, Professor Dawn Nunziata from the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. She said at a conference in February 2013 that my office organized, we need to deal with the internet and the security issues and regulation issues on the internet with a scalpel, not with a sledgehammer. What we experience, unfortunately, is a sledgehammer all the time. Just name it, on the copyright, on cyber data, governments are coming with a sledgehammer and no scalpel and no real thinking.
Thank you. And last but not least, Anya.
Technically challenged, I'm sorry. I'm going to very quickly try and answer 3 questions. The first one was in the front about the responsibility of businesses. I'm not going to answer it directly, but obviously one needs to send messages to businesses as well. The fact that in some parts of the world we don't do that as much is because the legal framework is still so problematic that just gets most attention. I'm always a little worried, though, when I see emphasis put on businesses from democratic countries that sell in non-democratic countries. The reason being that I think businesses actually do as much in the democratic world, and I think we have to keep that very much on the plate. And also, keep on the plate that both in the democratic and the not democratic world, different businesses have very different interests, and for that reason also very different roles to play. Sometimes even, for example, supporting free speech and being tremendously harmful for privacy. So I think all these complications are things that we need to take into account far more. That partly answers, I think it was Nasser who asked in the back the question about are governments the biggest threat to privacy? I think they're very much a big threat. But I do really think it's also important to keep businesses still in the picture. We don't actually talk about, I think, say what businesses do with our data, etc. I think despite in the EU there is a strong data retention debate, but in many other parts of the world there isn't, and I think that's an issue. And then finally, to briefly come to Jacob's question, you know, the thing you touched on is of course not just an issue on the internet, right? I think that's always the frustration for everybody who works with human rights frameworks. You work within the assumption that there will be a rule of law, and that so when the law is in place that things will actually work. And offline as well, you see that that's often not the case. And that's because it's not just about human rights in this narrow sense. It's also a political economy debate, which perhaps we don't always have enough when we talk about internet issues. But in the internet sphere, you can argue that that debate has become even more important because the national boundaries aren't so clear anymore. So what are the power relations you have to work with has become much more messy. How that will get resolved, I'm not sure. I sometimes wonder if we should also really reassess the role of sovereignty in the role of nation states. I'm sure that governments aren't so happy to hear that. But in any case, as an experiment, I think to deal with these issues, that distributed approach of governments might be a way forward, because at least it's very much a multi-stakeholder model, and the idea is that you don't just bring in the big businesses there, but that you bring in, say, the technical community as well when you talk to guys like you, when you talk about cybersecurity. So perhaps that's one way, at least an experiment that's worth trying out to deal with some of the challenges you raised. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thousands and thousands of issues. I hope we raised them out, even if we didn't do them all justice, but there's another 2 days ahead, so hopefully we can take them all a lot deeper. Can you please thank the wonderful panel and thank all of you for coming. It's lunchtime now.
Got a head full of lightning and a head full of rain, and I know that I said I'd never do it again. Oh, well, I love you, sweet baby, but I always take the long way home. Watch your back if I should tell. Your love's the only thing I'd ever know. One thing's for sure, sweet baby, I always take the long way home.